Your Honor, Your Worship, friends, it's my pleasure to be here on Treaty 6 territory to share some words with you tonight. My name's Alika Lafontaine. I'm an Oji-Cree anesthesiologist, born, raised, and trained here in Saskatchewan. Anesthesiologists have a big issue. People usually don't know what it is we do. So in order to mitigate that, we sat around, myself and some colleagues, and tried to come up with a really clear phrase to illustrate what it is we do. And we came up with the term medical ninja. Consider that we're highly specialized, we're dark and mysterious, and we're the last thing you see before you lose consciousness. 3 years ago, 3 First Nations in Saskatchewan declared an addictions and violence crisis. Senator Ted Cusance from the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations was invited by those 3 communities to solve the problem. He created a team and I was invited to be a part of it. In order to task the team with a direction, Senator Q invited us to answer the query, why are Indigenous peoples so sick? Over time, those 3 communities have grown into inclusion of 3 provincial territorial Indigenous organizations: the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations here in Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Keewatin-Awi, Okanagan in northern Manitoba, and Anishinaabe-Aski Nation in northern Ontario. Representing more than 150 First Nations, they have written a story as well as a plan on how to fix community crisis. In essence, what I'm here to do is to share their story. With any story, there's the need to establish some shared truths. And for their story, there's 3. The first is we need to understand that within Indigenous communities, there are perpetual crises. Although these crises may break into the national consciousness from time to time, just because the media quits paying attention does not mean that the crises disappear. The second is that we must recognize that systems produce outcomes. Outcomes can be identified because they're reliable and repeatable. If something continues to happen in a specified time, in a specified way, that is the outcome of the system, whether we find them desirable or not. The outcome of the Indigenous health system is crisis. We know that because it's both repeatable and reliable. This actually makes a lot of sense in the context of colonialism. Senator Murray St. Clair stated that the intent of colonialism was the extinguishment of rights of Indigenous peoples to land and resources. One of the most effective ways to accomplish this is crisis. You make people unable to exercise their rights because they're too sick. You have them leave their territory, which literally means they can't exercise their rights, or they die. We have colonial systems that we still implement, and we use incremental change in order to change them. When you incrementally change a system, you just make it more efficient and effective. It still produces the same outcomes. It should be no surprise then that after decades of incremental change, crises are happening faster and at an increased frequency than ever before. The third shared truth is that Indigenous peoples are in the position where they must change. We have no other choice. So what is the story? When you consider what happened in Launch here in Saskatchewan, a mental health crisis broke onto the national consciousness due to a very tragic situation involving several kids. That led to a meeting where the Prime Minister, as well as cabinet ministers, our Premier and his cabinet ministers, as well as health stakeholders from across the system came together to discuss solutions. Those solutions were supposed to lead to impact, and that impact was supposed to lead to decreased crisis. So the cycle that Indigenous peoples are told to expect is if you have a significant enough crisis, it will lead to a meeting, that meeting will lead to solutions, and those solutions will lead to impacts. The crisis continues to get worse, so that must not be what's happening. What the 150 First Nations have communicated to us is that something else is occurring that's rarely talked about. Between the crisis and the meeting, there's a series of side conversations that occur within government and between health stakeholders. A side conversation can be defined as any conversation that excludes the people you're trying to impact, as well as their natural decision-making processes. A person can be from a community that's affected, but if they don't feel a decision-making role within that community, that is a side conversation. The purpose of these side conversations is to create pre-allocations. Pre-allocations are defined as money that's already dedicated before it's announced. When Ontario announced $650 million for Northern Ontario, almost all of that money was already spent. Very little actually went to community. The reason why it was spent is because of these side conversations. When pre-allocations occur at the exclusion of community, you achieve outside implementation for nearly every solution. What that means is that capacity is never built within the community. It's always built outside. So while Indigenous people sit and wait for their crises to lead to meetings, to lead to solutions, and then impacts, in the hope that it will decrease the crisis, side conversations, pre-allocations, and outside agency implementation are leading to increased crisis. In order to resolve the crises in our communities, in order to transform the Indigenous health system, we must eliminate or minimize this outside circle. The first question I had when we identified this for the first time is, why does this not happen in Medicare? The answer is legislation, policy, and internal controls. These side conversations do happen, but they're always brought back into the inner circle. Conversations are all that happen within our mainstream healthcare system. Allocations are all that happen within our mainstream healthcare system. And implementation is always done with people who are affected. There's a quote from Carl Knorr, a past president of the Alberta Medical Association, where he says that we used to do things to patients, then we did things for patients. Now we strive to do things with patients. What that means is that we remain within the inner circle. If we want to build and desire a better Canada, we must bring legislation, policy, and inner controls into our Indigenous health systems, and we must reject incremental change. Incremental change will only lead to more crisis, and right now that is all that we are doing. In the Losh, almost $500 million has been spent in 12 years, with very little impact for the 3,000 residents that live there. We will continue to fail at fixing the crises within our communities if we do not change the way that we go about doing things. When we talk about colonized systems, we must transform systems unless we want the same outcomes. This is my community's story. This is our story. Thank you.